January 28, 1945, somewhere in the forests of eastern Germany, near the Oder River. The air smells of wet pine and ash. Snow falls in silence, heavy and thick, covering the broken machinery of war, a shattered Panzerfaust tube, a scorched Wehrmacht helmet, a discarded propaganda leaflet slowly turning to pulp. The cold is absolute. It seeps through wool, through skin, into bone. A young woman crouches behind the blackened skeleton of a farmhouse, her fingers numb, her breath shallow. She wears the gray-green uniform of a Nachrichtenfelon, a communications auxiliary of the German Wehrmacht. Her name is Marguerite. She is 19 years old. She has not eaten in 2 days. She has not slept in 3. And now, as the distant rumble of Soviet artillery grows louder, she knows the war has finally come for her. She does not run. There is nowhere left to run. By the time the first American jeep rolls into the clearing 3 days later, Marguerite is unconscious, half buried in snow, her lips blue, her pulse faint. She is found by a patrol of the U.S. Third Army, advancing eastward in the chaotic final weeks of the European War. The soldiers wrap her in a canvas tarp and carry her to a field hospital behind the lines. She wakes in a tent, disoriented, terrified. Her first coherent thought is not relief. It is fear. She has been taught, since she was 14 years old, what happens to German women captured by the enemy. She has heard the stories. She has read the pamphlets. She expects brutality. She expects cold indifference. She expects death, or something worse. What she does not expect, what she cannot begin to imagine, is the warm cloth placed gently into her trembling hands. To understand the shock of that moment, one must first understand the architecture of fear constructed in the minds of German civilians and soldiers throughout the war. From 1939 onward, the Nazi propaganda machine, orchestrated by Joseph Goebbels and his Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, waged a relentless campaign to demonize the Allies. Soviet forces were portrayed as subhuman hordes, driven by Asiatic barbarism. British and American soldiers were depicted as decadent materialists, puppet warriors of Jewish capital, devoid of honor or mercy. German women were warned, in posters, radio broadcasts, and newsreels, that capture meant unspeakable violation. The message was clear: surrender was not an option. Resistance, even unto death, was the only path. This indoctrination was not mere abstraction. It was woven into the fabric of daily life. Schoolchildren recited oaths of loyalty to the Führer. Hitler youth camps drilled boys and girls in the ideology of racial struggle. By 1945, as the Reich crumbled, the propaganda intensified. Goebbels' speeches grew more frantic, more apocalyptic. The enemy was at the gates. The enemy was merciless. The enemy would annihilate the German people, their culture, their very existence. For young women like Marguerite, conscripted into auxiliary roles as the Wehrmacht scraped the bottom of its manpower reserves, the weight of this indoctrination was inescapable. They were soldiers in spirit, if not in arms. They believed with the fervor of the desperate that their enemies were monsters, and then they met those enemies. And the monsters offered them warm cloths. The U.S. Army Field Hospital, where Marguerite awakens, is a study in controlled chaos. Canvas tents stretch in orderly rows across a muddy field. Inside, medics move with practiced efficiency, treating frostbite, shrapnel wounds, exhaustion. The air is thick with the smell of antiseptic, coffee, and cigarette smoke. Marguerite lies on a cot, her wrists unbandaged, her body covered with a rough wool blanket. She is not restrained. She is not interrogated. A medic, a young man from Iowa with a farmer's hands in a quiet manner, checks her pulse, listens to her breathing. He speaks to her in broken German. "You are safe. Rest now." She does not believe him. How can she? Safety is a word that has lost all meaning. But then, a nurse, an American woman in olive drab fatigues, approaches with a basin of warm water and a clean cloth. She kneels beside the cot. She dips the cloth into the water, wrings it out, and places it gently into Marguerite's hands. The warmth is almost painful. Marguerite's fingers, cracked and raw from cold, close instinctively around the fabric. The nurse smiles. It is a small smile, weary but genuine. She says something in English that Marguerite does not understand. But the gesture speaks a language older than words. Marguerite cannot open her eyes. Not because they are frozen shut, though frostbite has taken its toll. She cannot open her eyes because to do so would be to confront the collapse of everything she has been taught to believe. The enemy is not supposed to be kind. The enemy is not supposed to care whether she lives or dies. The enemy is not supposed to bring her warm water and clean cloths, and speak to her in a voice that carries no hatred. And yet here, in this tent in the middle of a war zone, surrounded by soldiers who could justifiably see her as complicit in a regime of unspeakable evil, she is treated not as an enemy, but as a human being. The warm cloth in her hands becomes, in that moment, a symbol, not just of American material abundance, though that too is part of the story, but of something deeper. A different way of seeing the world. A different understanding of what it means to wage war and what it means to win. The contrast between expectation and reality was not unique to Marguerite. Across Europe and the Pacific, as the Axis powers crumbled, millions of soldiers and civilians encountered American forces for the first time. What they found confounded them. German prisoners of war, processed through camps in France and Belgium, reported in home letters intercepted and analyzed by Allied intelligence, that they were fed 3 meals a day. Not gruel, not starvation rations, real food. Bread, canned meat, coffee. They were given medical care. They were allowed to write to their families. They were treated, in the words of one Wehrmacht sergeant captured at the Bulge, better than we treated our own wounded. Japanese soldiers, indoctrinated from childhood in the code of Bushido, were taught that surrender was the ultimate dishonor. To be captured was to be erased, not just from the army rolls, but from existence itself. Family members of POWs were often told their sons had died in battle, even when they were alive and in Allied custody. The expectation, drilled into every soldier, was that American and British captors would torture, mutilate, or execute prisoners. Yet when Japanese troops, starved and delirious, surrendered on islands like Okinawa and Saipan, they found themselves in field hospitals, receiving blood transfusions, painkillers, clean water. Some wept, some refused to eat, convinced the food was poisoned. One soldier, interviewed after the war, said he spent his first week in captivity waiting to be beheaded, only to be handed a clean uniform and a bowl of rice. This disconnect between the demonized image of the enemy and the lived reality of capture created a cognitive rupture. It forced prisoners to question not just the propaganda they had been fed, but the entire ideological framework that had justified the war. If the Americans were not monsters, then what did that make Germany? What did that make Japan? What did that make the soldiers who had fought, killed, and died in the name of regimes built on lies? The records from American military hospitals and POW camps in 1945 offer a window into this rupture. Medical logs from the 108th Evacuation Hospital, stationed near Aachen, Germany, document the treatment of over 3,000 German prisoners in the first 3 months of the year. The notes are clinical, detached, but the patterns are clear. Frostbite, malnutrition, infected wounds. Many prisoners arrived in states of severe physical collapse, the result of weeks or months without adequate food, shelter, or medical care. The German military, by early 1945, was a hollow shell, unable to supply its own troops, let alone care for them. The Wehrmacht's logistical infrastructure had disintegrated. Soldiers scrounged for food in abandoned villages. They wrapped their feet in newspaper to ward off frostbite. They marched until they dropped. American medics treated them anyway. The 108th records note the distribution of clean bandages, sulfa drugs to prevent infection, plasma transfusions for the critically wounded. In one entry, dated February 12, 1945, a doctor writes, German female auxiliary, age approximately 20, severe frostbite both hands and feet, dehydration, malnutrition. Treated with warm compresses, intravenous fluids, penicillin. Condition stable. Patient expressed disbelief at quality of care. That disbelief was the point. Not as a cynical propaganda tactic, though the Allies were certainly aware of the value of treating prisoners humanely, but as a reflection of a deeper cultural and ideological divide. The American way of war, for all its flaws and contradictions, was rooted in principles that Hitler's Germany and Tojo's Japan fundamentally rejected. The Geneva Conventions, the rule of law, the belief that even an enemy soldier retained certain inalienable rights. These were not merely abstract legalistic concepts. They were embedded in the training of every American medic, every officer, every infantryman. They shaped how the war was fought and how it ended. The warm cloth in Marguerite's hands is not just a piece of fabric. It is a manifestation of surplus. American industrial capacity, by 1945, was producing war material at a scale the Axis powers could not begin to match. The United States manufactured over 300,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, 2.4 million trucks, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition during the war years. But it was not just weapons. It was everything. Clothing, medicine, food, fuel. The U.S. military logistics network could deliver hot meals to the front lines, thousands of miles from home. It could airlift plasma to field hospitals in the middle of jungles. It could supply medics with clean bandages, clean water, clean cloths, for soldiers and civilians raised in the scarcity economies of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. This abundance was incomprehensible. Germany, by 1945, was starving. The Allied bombing campaign had shattered its infrastructure. Coal production collapsed. Food rations dwindled to starvation levels. Japanese civilians fared even worse. The home islands, blockaded by American submarines, were cut off from rice imports. People ate acorns, bark, sawdust mixed with flour. And yet, here were American soldiers, handing out chocolate bars to German children, sharing cigarettes with prisoners, wasting clean water to wash the hands of an enemy combatant. This abundance was ideological as much as material. It represented a worldview in which human life, even enemy life, had intrinsic value. It represented a society that could afford to be generous, not because it was soft, but because it was strong. The warm cloth was a rebuke, not spoken, not written, but felt, a silent counter-narrative to the propaganda that had defined Marguerite's entire adolescence. And the weeks that follow, Marguerite begins to speak. Not much, not at first. But slowly, haltingly, she answers questions. Where was she stationed? What was her unit? What does she know about German troop movements? The interrogations are conducted by a young lieutenant from military intelligence, a second-generation German-American who speaks her language fluently. He is patient. He does not shout. He does not threaten. He offers her coffee. She drinks it, still half expecting poison, and nothing happens. She eats a meal-canned stew, white bread, an apple, and nothing happens. She sleeps through the night, unguarded, and wakes to find herself still alive. The transformation is gradual. It does not happen all at once. There is no single moment of revelation. But piece by piece, the edifice of her belief system begins to crack. She learns that the stories she was told about Allied atrocities were lies. She learns that the Reich's promises of final victory were delusions. She learns that the Führer, the man she was taught to revere as a savior, has condemned his own people to annihilation rather than admit defeat. The cognitive dissonance is overwhelming. Some prisoners retreat into denial. Some cling to the old ideology, even in captivity. But others, like Marguerite, begin to ask questions. If the Americans are not monsters, then who is? She is not the only one. Across the POW camps of Western Europe, a quiet transformation is underway. German prisoners, exposed for the first time to uncensored news, to films documenting the liberation of concentration camps, to the sheer weight of evidence of their government's crimes, begin to reckon with the truth. Some refuse to believe. Some break down weeping. Some sit in silence, staring at the footage of Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, unable to process what they are seeing. The warm cloth, the hot meal, the clean bandages, these acts of basic humanity create the space for that reckoning. They strip away the propaganda. They force a confrontation with reality. The sound that haunts Marguerite, long after the war ends, is not the roar of artillery or the scream of dive bombers. It is the sound of water wrung from a cloth. The soft, almost musical patter of droplets falling back into a basin. She hears it in her dreams. She hears it when she wakes. It becomes, in her memory, the sound of the moment her world shattered and reassembled itself into something unrecognizable. Years later, in a letter written to a historian researching the experiences of German female auxiliaries, Marguerite will try to explain. "I cannot describe it properly," she writes. "I had been told all my life that the Americans were our enemies, that they would destroy us. And then I was their prisoner, and they gave me warm water to wash with. It was such a small thing, but it was everything. It made me realize how much I had been lied to, how much we had all been lied to." The letter, archived now in a university library in Munich, is one of thousands like it. Testimonies from ordinary Germans and Japanese, captured in the war's final stages, who experienced a rupture between ideology and reality. These accounts are often dismissed in popular memory as self-serving rationalizations. And perhaps, in some cases, they are. It is convenient, after all, to claim ignorance, to say, "We were deceived." But the document suggests something more complex. A genuine shock. A genuine reckoning. Not universal. Not complete. But real. The epilogue of Marguerite's story is both ordinary and extraordinary. She is repatriated to Germany in late 1945, part of a wave of prisoners returned to a country that no longer exists. The Reich is gone. The Führer is dead. Germany is divided, occupied, in ruins. She returns to her family's farm in Bavaria to find it burned, her father dead, her mother living in a displaced persons camp. She works as a translator for American occupation forces. She marries, eventually, a former Wehrmacht soldier who was also a prisoner of war. They build a life in the rubble. They do not speak much about the war. But on cold winter nights, when the wind howls and the memory of January 1945 creeps back, she sometimes holds a warm cloth in her hands and weeps. The cloth itself, of course, is long gone. But its significance endures. It stands as a testament to the power of small acts to shatter grand ideologies. The Nazi regime built its empire on myths of racial supremacy, on the dehumanization of enemies, on the glorification of violence. It demanded total loyalty, total sacrifice, total war. And in the end, it was undone not just by military defeat, but by the simple, stubborn insistence of its enemies that even a captured soldier deserved a measure of dignity. This was not weakness. This was not naivety. This was the assertion of a different moral universe, one in which the enemy remained human, one in which victory did not require the obliteration of the defeated. one in which a nurse could kneel beside a frightened girl in a gray-green uniform and offer her a warm cloth, knowing full well the crimes committed in the name of that uniform, and still choose mercy, the larger truth. The one that echoes across the decades is this: ideology is fragile. It thrives in abstraction, in distance, in the echo chambers of propaganda. But it crumbles in the face of lived experience. The warm cloth in Marguerite's hands was more powerful than 1,000 speeches by Goebbels, more persuasive than 1,000 propaganda posters, because it was real. It was tangible. It could not be explained away or rationalized or denied. This is the paradox of American power in the Second World War. It was not just the bombers and tanks and endless supply lines, though those mattered. It was the ability to project not just force, but values. The ability to fight a total war without surrendering the principles that justified the fight. The ability to see the enemy as human, even in the midst of slaughter. This was not always honored. There were atrocities. There were failures. There were moments when the myth of American exceptionalism collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. But the myth persisted, in part, because there was just enough truth in it. Just enough moments like the one in that field hospital, where a frightened girl received a warm cloth and felt the foundations of her worldview dissolve. The war ended. The prisoners went home. The tents were folded, the hospitals dismantled. But the memory remained. In letters, in testimonies, in the quiet, unspoken knowledge that the enemy had been, against all expectation, kind. And that kindness, more than any weapon, had won the peace. Marguerite could not open her eyes. Not because of the cold. Not because of fear. But because to open them was to see the world as it truly was, not as she had been taught it must be. And in that seeing, in that unbearable clarity, the old world died and a new one, fragile and uncertain, was born. The warm cloth remains. A symbol, a memory, a truth.